Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their edtech ideas into profitable businesses. Hi,
Hey,
Jason,
Jag.
welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneur Show. Thanks so much for taking time out for this.
Absolutely, Jag. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Likewise, Jason. Jason, before we deep dive into what you do, a quick question about how did you get into doing what you do, that is helping students with their career or picking universities? How did you get into it?
Great question. Thanks. So I have actually a bit of a funny story about that. I am a second generation college counselor. My father actually, who was a teacher at my independent school in Boston where I grew up, did college counseling for the school and was successful and built a bit of a reputation amongst the broader circles of his students. So their cousins, their friends, their siblings who weren't attending the school also wanted to work with him on their college applications, the essays, the strategy, the narrative, etc. So even from when I was, before I applied to college, when I was a teenager, I was exposed to what college counseling and mentorship looked like. And my father's always been a big inspiration for me, a huge role model in my life. So I think it really started from that. And when I was in my own undergrad, I was focused on creative writing and screenwriting in particular. And I've always loved storytelling. And so the idea of combining mentorship with storytelling in a very meaningful sense that was going to kind of have real impact on students' lives and futures was something that really drew me to this work. And I've been doing it now for 11 years. So I've learned lots of the ins and outs, and of course, not everything's rainbows and unicorns, but it's been very fulfilling in many ways.
Great, Jason. Jason, you talk about students rushing into what they want to study before truly understanding why they want to study in college, and you also say that in your experience the biggest external pressures, there are external pressures that push students into that mindset. What is that from your interactions with the students?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jag. So I think one of the big external pressures that's just fairly objective is students understand that indicating a major in college, or at least having a sense of what their major might be, has influence not only on their sort of application narrative and strategy to some extent, but also on their chances of admission to a lesser extent, and just how they're sort of positioning themselves in the process overall. And then, of course, students might also be thinking even beyond college toward career and opportunities that are more professional, depending on their mindset and their background. So that's one of the big external pressures that I think every student faces is, what do I want to say that I'm going to study in college? And so in that sense, they're already boxing themselves into what are the majors listed? What are the options available to me? Now, every once in a while, I have a student who says, I really want to be an independent scholar and pursue this program that's completely open-ended, or go to Brown and take full advantage of the open curriculum and make my education what it is that is unique, that I love and I'm passionate about. That can happen, but it's less often that a student comes prepared with that type of intrinsic
Right.
motivation to define their own pathway. So I think that's the biggest external pressure. Of course, it can also come from communities, schools, families, friends, etc. Um, I think that one of the things that students underestimate in the process is being able to come up with even mundane but heartfelt stories and anecdotes about moments in which curiosity was sparked, moments in which they went out of their way to learn about something just because it felt fun, just because it felt intrinsically interesting to them, and underselling that part of the narrative in college admissions and trying to sound too sophisticated and too adult almost in conveying one's interests often backfires for students.
Got it, Jason. Jason, this topic has always been a topic of interest or intrigue for me. That is, what is the right age for a student to come to a point where they have enough exposure to understand what their interests are? And you just said, a genuine moment of curiosity or a moment of um, interest kind of triggers something for them to pursue.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't come like that, right? For that, you need to first expose yourself to a lot of things, is what I think. When you meet these students, what do you think is the common factor amongst all of them who had that moment of, genuine curiosity or passion?
Yeah. So, in answering this question, I want to frame that I'm really speaking in large part about the American university application process here in American
Right,
colleges, and American top colleges in particular, because those are the ones that really prize this intellectual curiosity narrative as a big part of the admissions standards and admissions process when it comes to the sort of qualitative assessment. So, I just want to be really clear that colleges in other countries and systems, education systems in other countries, might have much less emphasis on that personal narrative, that intellectual narrative, and might really
right.
just be taking students based on their scores, their grades, and the sort of traditional metrics, right, that we quantify students' achievements with, right? So in the context of what connects students who are able to identify this spark, what I would say is this. I think it has to do with active introspection and reflection, and also it has to do with um, an honest approach to saying, well, this doesn't feel particularly special, or it doesn't feel particularly noteworthy, or sophisticated, or impressive. But then being able to sit with that memory anyway and say, well, if it doesn't feel like any of those things, why does it feel personally meaningful to me? Maybe it has a mundane element to it. Maybe I was just walking in the woods one day and I looked over and I saw the light reflecting through the trees in a certain way and it reminded me of X, Y, or Z, right? That story could relate to philosophy, it could relate to conservation biology, it could relate to even engineering or economics and business because um, when a student seeks the connections in their experiences and instead of rejecting a memory that feels overly simple says what is it about this memory that I keep coming back to and really digs into that process of internal what was my mindset at that time, what were my goals, what were my priorities in that moment, what was I wrestling with in a mental, emotional, social way. Often they're able to find a really meaningful and quite genuine connection with this sense of like, what do I love thinking about? What do I love wrestling with in terms of problems and questions, problems I want to solve, questions I want to answer? And even though I think that sounds a little bit abstract and vague still, I think that quality of really treating one's own intrinsic and natural sort of pathways of investigation as valuable, even when they're just valuable to you personally and on a very micro level, and not necessarily thinking every little question I need to ask myself is going to have global impacts for millions or billions of people, but rather it could just be something that really piques the interest that I have in that moment. Understanding the interest and understanding how and why it's piqued is a really important part of conveying to a college and conveying to adults in a general sense that you are someone who loves to think in a general sense, that you have this active imagination, active mind, where you are really confronting things in your life in a way in which you're using analysis and you're using your mental faculties to stretch yourself and to think in almost an intersectional way as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you said it's abstract or vague. I would be surprised if it is any more clearer because it's that kind of a topic. I don't think anybody's got a structured black and white answer to this particular question. And I don't think there is any other way than to, self introspect and, be highly self aware about certain moments for you to get there. And it's a long process, Jason. So, yeah, totally uh,
Well, maybe
got
it
your
maybe
point.
it would help, Jag. I'm just thinking about it for a moment. Maybe it would help if I gave a couple examples of students that I've worked with who have had this type of experience before. Would that be useful, you think? Yeah?
Absolutely. Yeah, please go for it.
Cool. So recently, I worked with a student who was really dead set on becoming a biomedical engineer. And of course, when you're 16 or 17, you have a sense of what technologies are used in hospitals and doctors' offices and in assessments and diagnostics and treatments, et cetera, that are maybe evolving and really essential to delivering healthcare. And this student had a really great, compelling personal story about his parent who went through a difficult physical health issue and was sort of saved by doctors and how he was inspired by that. But What was really tricky for the student was that he was used to speaking in this very sophisticated manner about biomedical engineering, almost as if he were an adult talking to other adults in this professional setting, in this career context. And it lacked a sense of genuine, like, why are you doing this? What is it about this topic that is driving you to learn more? Because it felt more like he was trying to always impress, right? Always like, this is how much I know about it. This is how much I see my career progressing in this way. And one thing that I think admissions officers, even at top colleges in the U.S., understand is when you're 17, you still need to ideally be a bit open-minded and receptive in terms of where your learning pathway might take you in the future. It's the very reason why so few students, really are expected to come in with a very set major at the beginning of their college experience. Rather, they're encouraged to explore. And so, one thing that emerged with this particular student was he had been doing these, sort of home cooked biology experiments that he did just for fun, where he was growing bacteria on leftover salsa he had made at home and sort of tracking it every day. And he was doing things like leaving cherries out near his kind of computer exhaust fan so they were getting really hot and studying what that did to them over time. And it was just this really like inconsequential, certainly done before type experiment, but he thought it was fun and he did it just honestly for kicks, right? And the more I got him talking about that, the more he really started thinking, this is something that I really enjoy, and this connects to my lab work in this way, and it connects to my research papers that I've written and published in this way, and it just shows that I'm someone who wants to actively use some of my free time, not all of it, but some of my free time, investigating and finding things that drive me on this curiosity level. I think that when he started reframing that to himself, it became a much more kind of heartfelt and compelling way for
Right.
him to introduce his interests, even in these kind of serious essays he was writing and interviews he was preparing for.
Got it, Jason. Thank you
Mm.
so much for that. It's really insightful. Even if you have genuine interest and if you're passionate about it, how you present it goes a long way. It has
Hmm.
to feel heartfelt and got it. Jason, if you remember in the pre-podcast call, one of the topics that we discussed, maybe we can touch upon is you said, not all of the colleges need test prep scores. There are colleges that focus on test prep scores. There are colleges that really don't are not looking. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things I would say is there are disciplines in college and beyond which really revolve around executing certain tasks and implementing domain expertise in a tight time constraint and doing it impeccably well. And of course, I think the number one thing that we can all identify in that space is engineering. And engineering is one of those areas in the undergrad in US where you are already really advancing toward a professional degree and a professional pathway very quickly. You cannot in the United States do a meaningful undergraduate degree in law. You can do an undergrad degree in business, but most of the time the top schools don't even offer an undergrad degree in business, and you have to go to do an MBA. Same thing with medicine. You can't really accelerate. You can do a BSMD program, but that's a very, very, very tiny, narrow little piece of students, right? So engineering, I would say, is far and away the sort of area where, when you think about it, yeah, an engineer needs to be equipped to sit down with focus and execute at a very high level and show their technical aptitude in not just their college experience, where they're going to have to take many, many tests, but even in their professional life beyond that. And so that's an area in which testing becomes very important. If you're an engineer and you're not a strong test taker, that's going to be a challenge for you to overcome in your admissions process. And it might be possible to do so, but it's something that you should emphasize in terms of your own preparation in that case. Um, the question of which colleges care more about it, I would say, I think obviously technical schools, right, based on what I've just said, and technical programs within universities are going to put a bit more emphasis on that. The other thing I'll say is you can definitely look at which universities and colleges have been test optional for a long time before COVID, right? Because COVID was when a lot of these schools felt sort of forced into going test optional
Right.
for a while because students didn't have access to tests. The SAT hadn't gone digital, et cetera, at that time, or at least not domestically in the USA. And there's always been really interesting conversation around are standardized testing more equitable in admissions or less equitable in admissions, and that's still a hot topic. Um, but I would say, for instance, U Chicago is a great example of a top ranked university that really said it's part of our mission, it's part of our ethos to go test optional. I forget exactly when it was, but at least 10, maybe 15 years before COVID. And of course, submitting strong test scores to U Chicago still matters a lot, but they've really made a commitment and it's part of their culture and it's part of their admissions team mission to say we're going to really take a deep qualitative review of students in addition to, of course, looking at their grades and the other core things that every admissions officer cares a lot about. So does that help answer the question in terms of
It does.
testing
It does.
and the
Yeah.
nuances there? Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. And you know, going back to our first question and taking off from there, how can parents, teachers, or mentors help students resist the pull of prestigious choices and instead explore what genuinely excites them? I know a part of the answer was there when you said, but from parents, teachers, and mentors, what can they do to help students?
Mm, yeah, it's a really good question. So, the first thing I'll always say is, of course, it's good to honor and to acknowledge that a school's reputation, a school's prestige, the network, and the name on a resume, etc., does have weight. It does have value, and so I think there's no sort of dismissing that altogether. And I think all of us want to be heard in these,
Yeah,
kind of um, beliefs that we bring forward first before we're ready to rethink them. So I think always acknowledging first, okay, this is real, this has pertinence, it has relevance is important. I think the next thing I typically try to do is I try to introduce different narratives about people that I know who are now very successful or very fulfilled, who took non-traditional pathways to get to where they are. Whether that's they started off at a community college and then really sort of found their motivation as a student within that context and then transferred to a university and really kind of took off from there. Whether it's I have some of my closest friends didn't go to college, didn't go to university. They grew up in other countries other than America. They grew up in other cultures. And two of them in particular that I'm thinking of are very successful in tech right now, having completely bypassed the college route. So even that's a kind of an extreme version of this type of example. I've also had students who went to a less selective college to start, did excellently there, transferred out, went to a college because it was for financial reasons. They got a full ride scholarship undergrad, and they, wow, we're going to save $200,000, and then went to an amazing graduate school program and took out loans at that point when they felt financially ready to do so. And so this is the type of story I like to introduce so that students can see, wow, there are all these role models that go beyond just the ones that graduated from this narrow echelon of schools that I'm looking at. And finally, the last thing I'll say is I try to always, of course, in colleges want to do this very much too. I try to always say to students, rather than grouping all schools with a certain, kind of buzzword attached to them into the same category, really go out of your way to learn about what the curriculum differences, the culture differences, the social and campus, and even the like kind of location differences are between these places. Really identify what you can contribute to and gain from. That's one of the sort of methodologies and frameworks that I use with my students. This idea of contributing and gaining. I can talk more about that. At this particular school, and do it in a way in which you've clearly distinguished those qualities in that school and in yourself, right, from the other schools that are often kind of lumped in with it. So for instance, if you're got a student who's focused on top 10 ranked schools or top 20 ranked schools, my rhetoric is often, if you're applying to more than half those schools, you haven't really learned about the schools enough to understand whether they're a good fit for you. Even if you're a very, very, very top student, applying to more than half the top 20 schools, it's going to show those colleges, oh, well, they just think they want to try to get in everywhere that's competitive, that's selective. It's not going to show the college, oh, this student really has intention in submitting this application to this school at this time in this way, and really believing in it.
got it, Jason. And
Yeah.
Jason, when there is this admissions going on, one of the things universities look at is probably the demonstrated achievement. And then,
Mm,
there's
mm.
also intrinsic motivation. But
Mm.
obviously, do you think uh, they can, is there a scope for colleges to also take into consideration the intrinsic motivation than just demonstrated achievement?
Mhm. So, Jack, I'm going to give a bit of a complex answer here. Hopefully, that's okay, because I think it's a really big question, and I feel like I need to frame it in different ways. All right.
Please go for it.
So, so the first thing I'll say is I think one of my other ways of explaining this phenomenon to parents and students is I think at this point there have emerged two big categories of highly selective and well-reputed schools in America. And the first of those categories is what I call yes and schools. And the second of those categories is what I call either or schools. And they're all excellent. They're all fantastic, wonderful universities or institutions of higher education and are going to propel students toward great futures, etc. But the distinction that I draw is the yes and schools are the schools that, just throwing out numbers here, ballparking, okay, they're schools that have 2,000 seats available in their incoming class, and they're getting 100,000 applications, and they have 50,000 of those applications are academically qualified, meaning 50,000, half of the applications that they receive are the very top test scores, the very top grades, achievements, etc. They just have every sort of quantitative metric you could look at that would say, this student should be admitted to this school. Clearly, they're academically on a level, intellectually on a level where they could succeed at this school. So then the question becomes, well, of those 50,000, how do you select, if you have 2,000 seats, the 4,000 students that you might admit in any given cycle? Um, and that becomes a really, really difficult question. That's why I call those schools the yes and schools. The yes and schools are the ones that say, we have really the luxury, the privilege, those schools, right, of not saying, do we want either the objective achievements, the kind of quantitative verification of this student's ability to succeed, and sorry, either this or the students' intrinsic motivation, their personal storytelling, their qualitative elements, their personal qualities. They can say we expect both of those things.
Right.
We need students who are not only achieving academically at a very high level, but willingly, proactively taking on challenges, creating opportunities for themselves outside of school, and showing that they have great moral character and engaging in their communities. And making time to do extra testing and competitions and other things like that, right? It's this yes and mentality. Now it's very intimidating, and I don't say that to scare students and to scare families, but just to give them a sense that when they apply to this type of school, that's often the type of very competitive candidate that they're going up against, and to tell them that these schools, that's why they have so much trouble making these decisions, and it's why they end up rejecting or not admitting so many students that they're well aware would succeed at their college, right? So not getting into a school doesn't mean that they think you wouldn't succeed there. And that's a very interesting sort of part of the process here. The either or colleges are almost just as prestigious often. They might have an acceptance rate a couple percent higher or something. I try not to
Right.
focus on those very blanket and misleading statistics often, but they're colleges that, in my professional experience and within college counselors who've been doing this for a long time, we understand that those colleges are such that if a student has a 4.0 GPA and great test scores, but they've had to dedicate all their time to school, or they play a sport really seriously, and they've had really little bandwidth for other extracurriculars, really little bandwidth for demonstrating other types of achievements outside of school, those schools are still going to give that student a serious read, a serious consideration. Likewise, if a student has a slightly more uneven transcript, or not the highest test scores, but they've done really cool things outside of school, right? And they have some sort of super compelling narrative about, like, this is why I'm motivated to do X, Y, or Z that wasn't really a part of my formal education. Those either or colleges are going to give that student a serious read, serious consideration as well. And so this is one of the big distinctions that I guide my students through, and families through as well, is understanding which are either or, which are yes and schools. And I think that uh, it's changing every year. The admissions landscape is radically kind of in flux. There are trends that hold for 3, 5 years, and then they shift. There are trends that you can't count on more than one admission cycle in a row. And so colleges are sort of like weaving in and out of these categories. Some colleges are expanding the number of seats at their schools. Some colleges are changing their admissions kind of valuations of different aspects of a student's profile. But that's typically the way that I frame this question of like, is this does this matter more or does this matter more? It really depends on what type of college you're applying to, whether they expect you to do everything excellently almost all the time, which I know is crazy, and it's a mind-blowing phenomenon that there are students who are doing that and capable of doing it, or whether they're expecting you to put your eggs in certain baskets and they're really open to seeing that you've done that with intention.
Got it, Jason. Uh, it's a it's a very interesting way of distinguishing the two types, yes and either or. I think if you get that answer for yourself, it should be easy to move forward.
Mm, mm,
Um, Jason, you in one of your posts, you talk about the Eisenhower decision matrix.
mhm.
So, what is it, and what are some other underrated productivity tools or techniques that have made a tangible difference for your, mentees?
Yeah, good question. So the Eisenhower decision matrix, I think many people are familiar with it. It's essentially um, categorizing work into four big buckets, and the four big buckets are in terms of urgency with the work and in terms of importance with the work. And so the sort of top left quadrant is both urgent and important, and this is work that needs to be done now, and you should do it. There's a work that's urgent but not important, and so that means it's something clerical, it's something administrative, and it needs to get done, and so that needs to often be the sort of second priority in a day-to-day basis. But it depends on your situation. Sometimes you can also farm out that work or assign that work to someone else that you're collaborating with, etc. So for instance, if a student is in their senior year and they're the president of a club at school and they need to submit this particular form to their school to get a license for some event that they want to throw, and they're in under the gun with their college applications, often that like urgent but not important category, or when I say not important, let's say not a big workload, not a strenuous task, okay, but still needs to get done. It needs to get done by a certain deadline. That's the opportunity I say to like practice your leadership, practice your building a legacy, training others to do these basic competencies. Find an underclassman who's a little bit less going on, and show them how to do this, and then trust them to do it. Right. There's the important but not urgent category. This often, something for students that would fall into this would be something like starting to think about a personal statement now in the springtime, or putting together their activity list, or developing a portfolio, or preparing for interviews. Meaning, all of those things are going to, by the time you apply to college, they're going to be really, really important. But right now in February or March, they certainly don't feel like there's somebody looking down your neck and like what's happening here, right? So they're not so urgent. So that's last category, and then the last one is not urgent, not important, and usually that's pretty forgettable. That means like just make sure that things that aren't worth your time aren't taking up your time, right? Um, this is I think I just gave a couple examples that hopefully make this clear,
Oh
but I
yeah,
think
yes.
so I won't go too much deeper into that. You asked about other ways that students can manage their time, manage their priorities. I think to be perfectly honest, one of the things that I do with my students is what I call accountability coaching. And one of the big things that I think is important is anxiety has to do with worrying about things outside of our control, and it has to do with worrying about things more in the distant future. And so, one of the things I try to relieve from my students is I try to reassure them again and again and again that I know the big picture plan, the big picture strategy. Right? I'm always keeping in mind how does a student move from where they are now to where they are 6 months from now to where they are a year from now to all the way through the college matriculation and beyond. And so, because I have that in mind, I help my students to say, you know what? I don't need to think about that. I don't need to think about what I'm doing in 6 months. I need to think about what I need to do tomorrow and this week, And that's all.
Right.
If they can keep their vision at that level, and then every once in a while we have these big strategic, or regularly, I should say, but we regularly, at different intervals, have big strategy conversations, and I show them you're working toward the plan. You're absolutely, by taking this next step, by putting your next foot in front of you, you're making your way toward this big vision that we have. and backwards planning from there. Now, is that possible to do fully independently? Sure, it is. But as any of us who have ever worked with a personal trainer in the gym before can tell you, knowing exactly the exercises that we should do to get where we want to be in 6 months, exactly the diet that we should take, and just trying to do it as a formula doesn't work really nearly as well as somebody there motivating us, helping us adapt the exercises based on how our body's feeling that day, looking at our diet again and reviewing what we can work on. And so in a lot of ways, I think that that's one aspect of my work that feels perhaps a bit more basic, but is no less important for students. And I think that finding someone who can help them with that, whether it's a counselor and a mentor, or even just like peer kind of mutual accountability support. I do that with other friends who are entrepreneurs. We have regular check-ins. I'm going to do it later today, where we just say, hey, here are some of the goals of projects I'm working on that nobody else really cares about, but I think it's cool and I think it's going to go great sometime. And then we get to hold each other accountable to that, right? What goals did you accomplish from the last conversation till now? So setting something up like that would often work with students. And everybody treats accountability differently. I'm someone where if I say something to someone who I care about, who I respect, and whose opinion I appreciate, right, then I'm very motivated to make that happen. And if I say it just to myself, it might not be but I also don't want to say it to everyone, because as soon as I say it to everyone, I get this feeling of accomplishment, like, oh, I already did it, but that doesn't work. So I
Right.
know that I need to keep a narrow circle of people, and helping my students understand what their accountability sort of rhythm is and what's going to help them execute is one of the things that I start off with.
Totally, Jason. Uh, Accountability coach, I've heard a lot of times in the past. It sounds very simple. People might think, oh, you know what, I really don't need one, I can do it. But I've experienced firsthand how the presence of another human being can make a huge difference. It's just something about the other person outside of your own self.
Right.
You having to answer them, it makes a difference.
Yeah.
That's pretty much how much I can articulate about it, but I can vouch for it.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because I love the way you're saying it, Jag. There, I mean, I think the person's not just a sounding board, but one thing that I'm a big believer in is this, positive motivation. So a desire to do something right because you committed to doing it, rather than a fear of doing something wrong because that other person has some sort of leverage over you. So that's one of the big things that I always say is like I'm not really giving my kids grades, like, yeah, I'm gonna be writing notes to their parents, and that's one thing that, if a person's a bad college counselor, they might use that as sort of like a threat, which is really a bad idea for anybody trying to do this work, I have to say. But really, I always say that to the kids. It's like I don't. All I have is carrots. I don't have any sticks. Like I don't have any way to punish. I'm not your teacher, who, if you do badly on this assignment, they're gonna give you a D, and then you're in trouble. I don't have that way of doing it. But I think what that allows is the freedom for kids to say, this is how I want to motivate myself to get done. This is the deadline. I always ask my students to sort of set their deadlines in collaboration with me. I say, when this assignment needs to get done, here's the overall goal. I think something like this would be a good deadline. What do you think? Is that achievable for you? Do we need to shift it around? And once they say, I'm going to get it done at this point, they're in control of that process. And even if I'm reminding them that they made this commitment, which is sometimes important, I think that they still get this feeling of I said I would do it, I want to do it, and it's not somebody else who's kind of imposing it upon me or being oppressive in any way. So I think that I do the same thing with my accountability buddies, I would say, right? Where it's like it's cool if I got really busy that week or I got sick and I just didn't get it done, like they're not going to be there telling me like, Jason, you're the worst and we're going to fire you as a friend, right? They're just going to say, hey, you didn't get it done this time, make it happen next week, right? And that's going to help
Yeah,
me keep the positive momentum rather
positive.
than
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
that fear of like, oh
There's
my
no
gosh, if I
demotivation
go
there.
wrong.
Yeah,
Exactly right. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what I meant, and I've experienced it as well, Jason.
Yeah.
Jason, my next question has got to do with you spoke about how your students saw incredible success with early decision and
Mm.
restrictive early action. What do you
Mhm.
think are the
Mhm.
biggest misconceptions about applying early, and when is it not the right strategy for the student?
Hmm. Hmm. So I think there are some different nuances here. It's a big question. I would say 90% plus of the time, it's really important for a student to apply early if their goals are, as most of my students are, to get into a great selective college in the USA. And the reason for that is that early decision, especially in restrictive early action, I would say restrictive early action is really only used by schools who fall in that yes and category, and it's to be honest, it's a little bit of a flex because those schools are basically saying, yeah, as long as you don't commit to going somewhere else, you also don't have to commit to us because we know we're such an attractive school that we feel really confident that if you get in, you're going to end up coming. And there's, I don't want to go so far as to say it's a kind of I'm going to pick my words here carefully. I think there's a very narrow echelon of schools that do what I call REA, restrictive early action. So I'm going to put that one aside for a second. I'd rather focus on early decision one, and early decision two. The reason these are so important is because simply by the one of the big misconceptions, I would say one of the myths, is that schools are like changing their admission standards or lowering their admission standards in these rounds. That is absolutely not the case. But the schools understand in early decision that if they accept that applicant will be attending their school. And so in terms of composing their class, meaning finding students from diverse backgrounds with diverse interests who they think are going to add to a sort of, the quote unquote vibrance of their class, and who are going to somehow kind of create and perpetuate the culture that they're looking for on campus, they have way more control over class composition in early decision one and early decision two. And that's why I've seen with my students, and just in a general sense, I've seen sort of 4 to 5 times the chances of admission in ED1 than RD, and 2 to 3 times the chance of admission in ED2 than RD, to these selective schools. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. And if you look at schools themselves, often schools are accepting 50% plus of their classes just in early decision these days. It can be more than that. And so that's the biggest reason I think it's so important. The question you asked was nice and complex. So you also mentioned like when might students not do that, or maybe how would they approach the process. Um, I guess a couple of factors. One of the only ways that a student can sort of that they're allowed to get out of an ED1 binding commitment if they're admitted is if they really have a need of financial aid, or if they have a big change in their financial situation between when they apply and when they hear back, which is
Right.
not so common, but it can happen. And then, the admissions office of that ED1 school doesn't give them the amount of funding that they need to make college possible. I'd say that's a very small proportion of students. But I do know that students who, really are relying on a lot of scholarship aid, are sometimes nervous about making the ED1 commitment in that way, especially because often ED is for private universities, and sometimes students, for instance, need to prioritize their flagship state school in order to ensure that it's affordable for them. So sometimes financial considerations, those are very complex. I just gave a very broad calculation. Everybody's situation is very different. I'll give an example, a better example of a particular student who knowingly decided to skip ED1 and ED2 this past year. This is a student who was based in Australia actually, and so that was one big factor. But the biggest factor for her was that she had her top two choices figured out, and they were UC Berkeley in California and UCL, University College of London in the UK. And both the UK schools, UCAS, with maybe the exception of Oxford and Cambridge, Oxbridge, which you have to choose one of and you apply to early, but those top schools and then also the UCs, they don't offer any early decision option. They don't even offer any sort of alternative timeline decision. They have
Right.
one application for every one of those campuses that every student has to hit, and then they get their decisions back. And so, because this particular student also wanted to study architecture, so she had a very narrow profile, was very specialized already, had a great portfolio, and she had really good reasons for these two schools being her top two choices. So in the end, she did apply REA because it wasn't restrictive. But I thought that that was a really good example of a student who was using their own intrinsic values and this strong sense of fit, this strong sense of direction to make a rational decision to skip early decision because they really wanted to leave open this chance of getting into UC Berkeley and UCL. And I did have a student 4 or 5 years ago who did exactly this because of the UCs. She was in state in California, and she was eventually accepted to UC Berkeley, which was a very happy story because, of course, it makes a college counselor a little bit nervous to hear a student wants to forego ED1 when their family does have the resources and they have the sort of accolades and profile necessary to be successful in that process. So sorry, that was a long
Oh no,
answer,
it
but
really
hopefully
the
informative.
examples really help. Yes, yes,
Okay,
totally,
good,
Jason. Listen,
good.
thanks so much for diving deep into all of the questions that I asked and talking about the technical aspects of what you do. I'll probably conclude with this question: if you can share
Hmm.
to the listeners, if there are parents or students, about, so far you spoke about how you've done things. And if you can talk about what you do and,
Mm.
other details that parents or students might want to know about working with you, that'll be great.
Sure, sure, yeah. So I think that one of my favorite parts of doing this work is building very close and trusting relationships with not just students, but parents and families, um, over ideally, multi-year long kind of engagements. And the reason I emphasize that when you ask what I do and what people could expect from me is one of the most rewarding pieces of feedback that I get in my work every year, which is really nice, is to hear from families, wow, this process, because we brought you on and because we trusted you to help us with this, I call it a communication triangle between the counselor, the parent, and the student. They often actually say to me, our relationship improved, or at least we didn't deal with the stress and the tension that other
Right.
families that we know, handled because there was someone in the kind of passenger seat directing everything, but also just easing communication, easing stress within families is sort of a very positive byproduct often of the main work that we do together. So I think that any student who would meet me in any family could expect a couple things. First thing is just me to share any valuable advice, guidance, strategy right off the bat with them in that meet and greet call, even if they don't end up working with me. Just trying to help them think through their own decision making process and respecting that involving a counselor is a big decision, and everybody needs to make that for themselves. So really, no pressure and no stress to do so. I'm not a sales pitch kind of guy, and I also really love to just give value for free, like I'm doing in this interview right now. Right, just try to help people as much in that 30 minutes as I possibly can. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be, yeah, desire to really, get to know a student on a level that goes beyond just, what do you want to study next year, and when's your next SAT, and these are the summer programs you should do, and helps them to do that deeper digging in themselves that makes them feel like the decisions that they're making for how they spend their time and energy are really aligned with who they want to be and who they feel like they are right now. And again, that all sounds a little cheesy and cliche, but we covered a lot of it earlier in this conversation, so hopefully
It's
people
not.
can see the tangible side of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the last thing I'll say is again what we were just talking about, which is this sense that I will always bear the big picture strategy in mind. And the big picture strategy in this work involves not just the vision of the student, but also the considerations of the family and understanding and acknowledging where the parents are coming from and trying to help them and unite and align their various kind of priorities and goals within that family structure, right? Whatever that is. So keeping that big picture strategy in mind, keeping the relationship, kind of flowing and the communication flowing and the transparency and trust very high through sort of a high touch approach to just checking in often, and then doing kind of adding the positive benefit of not having to have the student and the family worried so much about the big picture strategy, the 6 months, 1 year down the road, but just thinking if I execute on what I'm doing today, what I'm doing this week, what I'm doing this month, I'm going to be working in the right direction, and I'm going to be adding toward the kind of goals that I've set, and building towards something that I'm really excited about in the future. Does that make sense?
Totally, Jason. And also, you have the luxury of drawing upon from so much of your experiences that you've had, like some of the examples you've shared.
Mm,
People don't have to go through those experiences all over again. And, from somebody else's lived experience, there's a lot to take away and a lot of time to be saved. Energy. I
that's a
mean,
great
it's
point. That's a great
invaluable.
point,
Yeah.
Jag. Yeah, I just yesterday was reading some really inspirational personal statements with a new student I've started working with, and was super impressed with his level of clarity and incision in terms of critical analysis of these essays. And it was really cool to see him light up with excitement, like, "Ooh, here's an idea, or here's a structure, here's a technique that I think I can borrow in this way, and here's a story that connects to my background that maybe I can use as a hook or an anecdote here." So you're absolutely spot on that I have a lot of the not just the understanding of the kind of landscape admissions overall, the big picture of data and where students are going and where institutional priorities are, where the funding within that college is going, what types of students they're looking to attract, etc. But also, like you said, the students I've worked with in the past, the students I've talked to, and families I've talked to in the past, and their results. And I also even connect my students with my alumni often at the colleges that they want to go to. So if I hear they want to go to WashU, or I hear they want to go to U Chicago, or MIT or Brown, I've got students at all these places that are more than happy to kind of take them under their wing, or at least have a 20-minute chat of just like, hey, what do you think of life there? What's going on behind the scenes? What do you think is uniting the student body here in a way that's something that I could learn from, and that could help me assess whether this is really the right place for me.
I think that's priceless.
Awesome.
Jason, thanks so much for your time. And, thank you for sharing all the things that uh, known about. It was great. Thank you, Jason.
Jag, likewise, I felt the questions were so thoughtful today. Really appreciate your heartfelt preparation and the authenticity you brought to this conversation. I can tell how much you and your colleagues really care for students and their success in a broad sense. And so I'm a big believer in the work you guys are doing. And it was a total pleasure to be on the podcast with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason.